Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the 1883 Krakatoa Eruption, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about the loudest sound in recorded human history, one that literally burst eardrums 40 miles away. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Feel free to turn down the lights, maybe put on a fan for that gentle hum, and settle in as we journey back to August 27th, 1883, to one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. Why you wouldn't last a day living on Krakatoa Island, 1883. Picture yourself waking up on Krakatoa Island in the summer of 1883. The year is drawing to a close, but you don't know that you're living through the final months of this island's existence. You don't know that beneath your feet lies a volcanic system so powerful that when it finally unleashes its fury, the sound will travel around the entire Earth for times. Your day begins before dawn, as it always does in the tropics. The air is thick, oppressive, laden with moisture that clings to your skin like a damp blanket. You're not here by choice, you understand. Very few people chose to live on Krakatoa. You might be one of the handful of lighthouse keepers maintaining the beacon that guides ships through the treacherous Sunder Strait. Or perhaps you're part of a small mining operation, extracting pumice from the island's volcanic soil. Maybe you're a fisherman who's made the dangerous journey here because the waters around Krakatoa, heated by underwater thermal vents, teem with fish. Whatever brought you here, you wake each morning to the same unsettling reality. The ground beneath you is never quite still. Small tremors ripple through the earth constantly, so subtle you've almost learned to ignore them. Almost the island sits directly above one of the most volatile volcanic systems on Earth, part of the infamous Ring of Fire. You're living on what amounts to a geological time bomb. But in 1883, without modern seismology, you have no way of truly understanding the magnitude of the danger. Your morning routine is dictated by survival. Water is your first concern. The island has no freshwater springs, so every drop must be collected from rainfall or brought in by boat from the mainland. You've learned to position every available container, every piece of canvas, every hollow gourd to catch the precious liquid when the tropical storms roll in. But these storms are becoming strange lately, more frequent, more intense. The air pressure feels wrong somehow, though you can't quite put your finger on why. As you step outside your crude shelter, built from whatever materials you could scavenge or bring from Java, the first thing that hits you is the heat. Not just the tropical heat you'd expect, but something more intense, more penetrating. The island's volcanic activity is increasing, though you don't yet understand the implications. Hot springs that were once merely warm are now scalding. The ground in certain areas burns your bare feet if you're not careful. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of whatever fish you managed to catch the previous day, dried in the scorching sun. And perhaps some rice, if you're fortunate enough to have any remaining from your last supply run to the mainland. The fish taste different lately, more sulphurous, as if the very waters they swam in were being slowly poisoned. You don't realize it, but gases from the volcanic system below are beginning to leach into the surrounding ocean, changing its chemistry in ways that will soon prove catastrophic. The workday begins with checking your equipment, whether that's lighthouse mechanisms, mining tools, or fishing nets. Everything corrodes faster here than anywhere else you've ever lived. The air itself seems to eat away at metal, leaving everything covered in a thin film of rust and salt. You've learned to perform maintenance constantly, obsessively, Because failure of your equipment doesn't just mean inconvenience, it means death. If your boat fails, you're stranded. If your lighthouse fails, other ships will crash on the hidden reefs that surround the island like a necklace of death. The island's wildlife provides both sustenance and constant reminder of how precarious your situation truly is. The birds here behave strangely, more aggressively than their mainland cousins. They seem perpetually agitated, their calls more shrill and desperate. You notice they're leaving more frequently now, great flocks of them departing for Java or Sumatra without returning. You should probably pay more attention to this exodus, but you're too focused on your immediate survival to consider what the animals might know that you don't. By mid-morning, the heat becomes nearly unbearable. The sun beats down mercilessly, but it's not just solar heat you're feeling. The island itself is warming from below, like standing on a massive underground furnace that someone is slowly turning up. You seek shade wherever you can find it, but even the shadows provide little relief. The very air shimmers with heat, creating mirages that make the distant mountains of Java dance like spirits. Your water supply requires constant attention. What little fresh water you have must be carefully rationed and protected from contamination. The increasing volcanic activity means more ash and sulfur in the air, which settles into your water stores and turns them bitter and potentially dangerous. You've learned to cover everything, to filter what you can through cloth. But you're fighting a losing battle against the island's increasing toxicity. Lunch consists of more preserved fish and perhaps some tropical fruits if you've been fortunate enough to find any that haven't been withered by the increasingly harsh conditions. The coconut palms that once provided reliable sustenance are showing signs of stress, their fronds yellowing and dropping more frequently. Even the hardy plants that thrive in volcanic soil are beginning to struggle. The afternoon brings the real dangers. As the day heats up, the volcanic activity increases. Small earthquakes become more frequent, stronger, more unsettling. You feel them in your bones, in your teeth, in the very core of your being. The island groans beneath you, a sound like no other you've ever heard, low and continuous and deeply wrong. It's the sound of immense geological forces building toward something catastrophic. Your afternoon work, whatever it may be, is constantly interrupted by the need to secure your belongings against the increasing seismic activity. Tools fall from shelves, water containers overturn, carefully maintained equipment shifts and breaks. You're in a constant state of alert, ready to grab what's most essential and flee at a moment's notice. But where would you flee to? You're surrounded by miles of ocean, and your escape routes are limited to whatever boats you can maintain in working condition. The air quality deteriorates throughout the day. What begins as a faint sulfur smell in the morning becomes a choking miasma by afternoon. Your eyes water constantly, your throat burns, your lungs struggle with each breath. You've fashioned crude masks from available cloth, but they provide minimal protection against the increasing toxic gases rising from the earth beneath you. As evening approaches, you face perhaps the most dangerous time of day. The temperature differential between the scorching day and the still warm night creates wind patterns that can change rapidly and without warning. If you're operating a boat, these sudden wind shifts can drive you onto the jagged coral reefs that surround the island. If you're working on land, the changing air pressure can trigger rock slides or sudden ground subside. Your evening meal is eaten quickly, nervously, always with one ear, listening for changes in the island's ominous rumbling. You've learned to distinguish between different types of seismic activity. There are the small, sharp shocks that make your teeth chatter. There are the rolling, wave-like motions that make you seasick on dry land. And there are the deep, slow tremors that seem to come from the very center of the earth. the ones that make you question whether you'll see another sunrise. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the 1883 Krakatoa eruption. Night brings little relief from the day's dangers, only different ones. The darkness hides the visual warnings that might help you avoid hazards, while the sounds of the island become amplified and more ominous. Every crack of settling rock, every splash of wave against shore, every rustle of struggling vegetation takes on sinister significance. You sleep when you can sleep at all, with your most essential supplies within arm's reach and escape routes planned and replanned in your mind. The humid air makes sleep fitful and unsatisfying. You wake frequently, drenched in sweat that won't evaporate in the thick atmosphere. Each awakening brings the same question: is this another ordinary night of discomfort? Or is this the night when the island finally releases the tremendous forces building beneath you? Your shelter, whatever form it takes, is a constant source of anxiety. Built to withstand tropical storms, it's completely inadequate for the geological violence that's building around you. The increasing seismic activity loosens every joint, shifts every foundation, cracks every wall. You spend significant time each day reinforcing, repairing, rebuilding, knowing all the while that when the final catastrophe comes, no human construction will provide safety. The isolation weighs on you constantly. Days or weeks can pass without seeing another human being. When supply boats do arrive from the mainland, they stay only long enough to complete their business before hurrying away, as if they sense something wrong about the place that you, living here daily, have become numb to. Their crews speak in hushed tones about the strange lights they see rising from the island at night, the unusual cloud formations that hover overhead, the way their compass needles spin erratically when they approach. Your tools and equipment require constant maintenance in the harsh environment, but replacement parts are difficult to obtain and expensive to transport. Every broken item represents a potential catastrophe. A failed lamp could mean death in the darkness. A broken fishing net could mean starvation. A damaged boat could mean permanent stranding on an island that's slowly becoming uninhabitable. The psychological toll of living under such conditions is perhaps the heaviest burden of all. You exist in a constant state of low-grade panic, always alert for signs of immediate danger, never able to fully relax or feel secure. The beautiful tropical sunsets that once filled you with peace now seem ominous, the colors too vivid, the sky too restless. The gentle lap of waves against the shore sounds more like the ocean preparing to reclaim the land. As you prepare for another night of uneasy sleep, you don't realize that you're living through the final weeks of one of the most famous geological disasters in human history. You don't know that the forces building beneath you will soon release energy equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs. You don't know that the sound of that release will be heard thousands of miles away, or that the tsunamis it creates will kill tens of thousands of people across the region. All you know is that each day feels more dangerous than the last. Each night brings stranger dreams, and the island beneath your feet grows more restless with each passing hour. You're living on borrowed time in a place that nature never intended for human habitation. And deep down, in the part of your mind that still connects to ancient survival instincts, you know that something terrible is coming. Your relationship with time becomes distorted in this environment of constant threat. Minutes feel like hours during the most intense seismic episodes, while entire days can blur together in the monotonous struggle for survival. You've lost track of exact dates, marking time instead by the intensity of the island's geological activity. There was the week of the red sunsets, when ash in the upper atmosphere painted the sky the color of blood. There was the month of the singing rocks, when certain formations began emitting haunting musical tones as gases escaped through newly formed cracks. The wildlife that remains grows increasingly desperate and dangerous. Rats, normally cautious creatures, have become bold and aggressive in their search for food, as their usual sources become contaminated or destroyed. The few remaining birds exhibit manic behavior, flying in erratic patterns and calling out at all hours with sounds you've never heard before. Even the insects seem affected, with swarms of flies and mosquitoes that appear and disappear without warning, as if driven by some invisible force. Your body adapts to the harsh conditions in ways both helpful and alarming. Your lungs have developed a tolerance for the sulfurous air that would leave a newcomer gasping and retching. Your skin has become leather tough from constant exposure to heat and corrosive gases. Your hands are permanently stained and scarred from handling equipment in the abrasive environment. Yet these adaptations come at a cost. You suffer from persistent headaches, likely from breathing toxic fumes. Your joints ache constantly from the combination of hard work and the strange atmospheric pressures that seem to fluctuate with the island's geological moods. Sleep, when it comes, brings no peace. Your dreams are filled with visions of the island splitting apart, of massive waves washing over everything you've built, of sounds so loud they shatter your bones. These aren't merely anxiety dreams. They're your subconscious mind processing the subtle signs your conscious mind refuses to fully acknowledge. The increasing frequency of small earthquakes, the rising temperature of the hot springs, the strange phosphorescent glows that appear in the water at night, all point to something unprecedented building beneath your feet. Your emergency preparations become more elaborate and desperate with each passing week. You've cached supplies in multiple locations, each one carefully chosen for what you imagine might be the safest spots on the island, though safety is entirely relative in such a place. You've practiced evacuation routes in darkness, timing how long it takes to reach your boat from various points on the island. You've even attempted to construct a crude raft as backup, though the materials available make it barely seaworthy. The isolation plays tricks with your mind. You find yourself talking to inanimate objects, having full conversations with your tools, your shelter, even the island itself. Sometimes you catch yourself listening for responses, as if the rocks and trees might suddenly offer advice or comfort. The boundary between rational thought and survival madness blurs in the oppressive heat and constant danger. Weather patterns around the island have become increasingly erratic and violent. Sudden storms appear from clear skies, bringing winds that can knock a person off their feet and rain that stings like needles against your skin. The storms seem to trigger increased seismic activity, as if the atmospheric violence awakens something deep underground. You've learned to read the subtle signs that precede these meteorological assaults, but they provide little comfort when you have nowhere to seek proper shelter. The tragedy is that when it finally comes, when Krakatoa unleashes its fury on August 27, 1883, there will be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no way to survive the loudest sound in recorded history, the story of Buyerink and the final warnings. Now let us turn our attention to one man whose story illuminates the final days before catastrophe. A man whose dedication to duty would cost him everything, yet whose observations would help scientists understand one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. His name was Buyerink, though history has preserved little about his personal life beyond his role as the chief lighthouse keeper stationed on Krakatoa Island. In the summer of 1883, he was one of perhaps a dozen people living permanently on the island, maintaining the crucial beacon that guided ships through the treacherous Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra. What we know of his final weeks comes from his meticulous logbook entries, telegrams sent to authorities in Batavia, and the testimony of the few boat crews who visited the island in those last days and lived to tell about it. Beierink was a methodical man, trained in the Dutch colonial tradition of precise record-keeping. His lighthouse logs from early 1883 show a routine existence, noting weather patterns, ship sightings, equipment maintenance, and the small details that make up a lighthouse keeper's solitary life. But as spring turned to summer, his entries began to change, becoming more frequent, more detailed, and increasingly urgent. On May 20th, 1883, Beierink recorded the first significant seismic event in his neat, careful handwriting. Violent shaking at 10:02 a.m., he wrote. Duration approximately 30 seconds. Lens apparatus disturbed. Resetting required. This was not unusual. Earthquakes were common in the region, part of life along the Ring of Fire. What was unusual was what followed over the next few weeks. By late May, Beierink was recording multiple seismic events daily. His entries show a man trying to maintain professional composure, while documenting increasingly alarming phenomena. Continuous low rumbling heard throughout day, reads one entry. Source appears subterranean. No visible damage to lighthouse structure, but concern growing among local fishing crews who report strange behavior in marine life. The first week of June brought changes that even Beierink's methodical nature couldn't entirely contain. His handwriting, usually so precise, began showing signs of strain. Ground temperature rising near North Shore hot springs, he noted. Water now scalding, vapor visible at considerable distance. Local birds departing in large numbers. Request guidance from Batavia authority. His telegram to the colonial administration in Batavia was terse, professional, but carried an undertone of growing alarm. Unusual seismic activity, Krakatoa, requesting inspection teams soon as possible. Conditions deteriorating. Lighthouse operations continuing, but situation bears monitoring. The response, if there was one, has been lost to history, but given the slow pace of colonial bureaucracy and the remoteness of Krakatoa, it's likely that Beierink received little more than an acknowledgement of his concerns. Throughout June, Beierink's logs paint a picture of a man increasingly isolated, not just geographically, but by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. His professional training told him to maintain the lighthouse at all costs. But his growing understanding of the danger suggested evacuation might be wise. Yet where could he go? His relief wasn't scheduled until September, and the irregular supply boats were his only connection to the outside world. The entries from mid-June show Beierink beginning to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Explosive sounds heard throughout night, he recorded on June 15th. Direction appears northwest sector of island. Investigation revealed new fissures in rock formations, emitting steam and sulfurous gases. Vegetation in affected area showing signs of distress. His scientific curiosity, perhaps awakened by the extraordinary nature of events, led Beierink to make increasingly detailed observations. He began measuring water temperatures at various hot springs, noting wind direction changes, documenting the strange colored sunsets that were becoming more frequent. His lighthouse log was transforming into a scientific journal, a record that would prove invaluable to volcanologists studying the eruption decades later. By July, Beierink was no longer alone in recognizing the growing danger. Supply boats began arriving more frequently, their crews reporting that the island could be heard rumbling from miles away. But these visits became increasingly brief, with sailors reluctant to linger near what they could sense was becoming a very dangerous place. Captain Vanderberg departed hastily this morning, Buyerink wrote on July 8th, refused to remain overnight despite urgent need for lighthouse supplies. Crew reported compass irregularities and unusual wave patterns during approach, beginning to question wisdom of maintaining station, but duty requires lighthouse remain operational for shipping safety. Here we see the tragic nobility of Buyerink's situation. He understood the growing danger, but his sense of duty to the ships that depended on his lighthouse kept him at his post. The Sunda Strait was one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, carrying trade between Europe, India, and the Far East. Without his beacon, ships would face the deadly coral reefs that surrounded the island in darkness. Throughout July, his entries document phenomena that modern scientists recognize as clear warning signs of massive volcanic activity. New fissures appearing daily, he noted on July 20th, some emitting gases that cause severe respiratory distress, abandoning inspection of North Shore areas due to toxic conditions. Lighthouse operations continuing but becoming increasingly difficult due to ground instability. The heat was becoming unbearable, not just from the tropical sun, but from the volcanic activity below. Buyerink reported that metal tools were too hot to handle in certain areas of the island, that the ground was warm to the touch even in shaded areas, and that the hot springs were now boiling violently, sending up clouds of scalding steam that made portions of the island uninhabitable. His isolation was nearly complete by early August. The last supply boat had left in late July, and its captain had strongly urged Buyerink to abandon his post. "Cannot, in good conscience, leave lighthouse unmanned," was his response, recorded both in his log and in the testimony of the boat's crew when they returned to Batavia. By mid-August, Buyerink's entries take on an almost surreal quality, describing conditions that seem to belong more to fantasy than reality. Sky remains overcast despite no rain clouds visible, he wrote on August 15th. Color of atmosphere unusual, yellowish cast that persists throughout day. Sea surface temperature elevated beyond normal ranges. Fish appearing dead in large numbers, floating belly up near shore. We might pause here to consider commenting below about what historical disaster you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and let us know how you're doing. Your engagement means the world to us and makes you an important part of our little corner of the internet. The psychological toll on Buyerink becomes evident in his later entries. A man who had maintained precise, professional logs for years began including personal observations, fears, and even philosophical reflections. "Find myself questioning the wisdom of duty above survival," he wrote on August 18th. Yet what manner of man abandons his post when ships depend upon the light? Perhaps there are fates worse than death, and dereliction of duty ranks among them. His final entries, written in the last week of August, reveal a man who had come to terms with his likely fate, while continuing to perform his duties with extraordinary courage. "Seismic activity now continuous," reads his entry from August 24th. "Ground movement so severe that lighthouse mechanism requires constant adjustment. Sleep impossible due to noise and vibration. Yet ships still pass, and light still guides them safely." The last entry in Buyerink's log is dated August 26th, just one day before the catastrophic eruption. His handwriting, usually so controlled, shows signs of extreme stress, but the content remains focused on his duties. Explosive activity increasing throughout day. Lighthouse beam visible despite daylight due to atmospheric conditions. Prepared final equipment reports. Should circumstances permit, will attempt to maintain beacon until relieved or position becomes absolutely untenable. What happened to Buyerink in those final hours remains a matter of speculation. But given the violence of the eruption and the fact that no trace of the lighthouse or its keeper was ever found, his fate seemed certain. When Krakatoa exploded with the force of thousands of atomic bombs on August 27, 1883, it obliterated not just the lighthouse, but 2/3 of the island itself. The irony of Beyrink's sacrifice is profound. His dedication to maintaining the lighthouse for the safety of ships meant that he remained at his post as conditions became unsurvivable. Yet when the final eruption came, no lighthouse could have helped any vessel in the region. The explosion created tsunamis over 100 feet high that would have destroyed any ship, regardless of navigation aids. Yet Beyrink's legacy extends far beyond his tragic end. His meticulous observations, recorded faithfully until the very end, provided scientists with invaluable data about the precursors to massive volcanic eruptions. His logs helped establish patterns that modern volcanologists still use to predict volcanic activity and evacuate populations before disasters occur. The story of Beyrink represents something essentially human. The conflict between duty and survival, the tragedy of good intentions in the face of forces beyond human control. He was a man who chose to stay when leaving would have been wise, who maintained his post when abandoning it would have been understandable, who continued working when the very ground beneath his feet was preparing to explode with unprecedented violence. The physical deterioration of both the lighthouse and its keeper becomes evident in the final entries. Beyrink reported that the lighthouse lens system required cleaning multiple times daily due to the increasing ash and sulfur particles in the air. The metal fittings were corroding at an alarming rate, requiring constant maintenance and improvised repairs using whatever materials he could salvage or fashion from the island's limited resources. His personal condition was equally concerning. References to severe headaches, persistent cough, and difficulty breathing appear regularly in his later entries. "Find myself increasingly short of breath during routine maintenance," he wrote on August 20th. "Suspect atmospheric conditions affecting respiratory function. Nonetheless, beacon must remain operational." These symptoms, likely caused by volcanic gases, were clear indicators of the toxic environment he was enduring. The isolation took on an almost supernatural quality in those final days. Beyrink reported strange auditory phenomena that went beyond the geological rumbling, heard what appeared to be human voices calling across the water during night watch. He noted on August 22nd, investigation revealed no vessels in vicinity. Perhaps atmospheric disturbances creating acoustic illusions, or perhaps solitude affecting perception. Modern science understands that the changing atmospheric pressure and gas composition could indeed create unusual sound phenomena. But for a man alone on an increasingly hostile island, such experiences must have been deeply unsettling. His relationship with the local wildlife became a source of both companionship and growing alarm. A small population of cats that had historically helped control vermin around the lighthouse facilities began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. Cats refused to enter certain areas of island, Beyrink observed, appear agitated, vocalizing at frequencies not previously noted. Their instincts perhaps more attuned to geological danger than human reasoning. These animals, like many creatures sensitive to seismic activity, were likely detecting subsonic vibrations and electromagnetic changes that preceded the eruption. The practical challenges of maintaining the lighthouse became increasingly insurmountable. The lamp oil, carefully rationed to last until the next supply delivery, was being consumed more rapidly due to the need for continuous operation in the strange, darkened atmosphere. The mechanism that rotated the lens required constant adjustment as the building's foundation shifted with each seismic event. Even simple tasks, like climbing the lighthouse stairs, became dangerous as the structure swayed and groaned under geological stress. Beyrink's attempts to communicate with the outside world became more desperate and creative. Unable to rely on scheduled supply boats, he began improvising signal methods. He reported fashioning reflective signals using polished metal during daylight hours, hoping to catch the attention of passing ships. He even attempted to construct crude message containers that he could set adrift, though the increasingly violent wave action made this largely futile. His final entries reveal a man grappling with profound philosophical questions about duty, survival, and the meaning of individual sacrifice in the face of natural forces beyond human comprehension. Wonder if history will remember the lighthouse keeper who stayed too long, he wrote on August 25th, or if such small acts of duty are lost in the greater catastrophe. Perhaps the light itself is monument enough, burning until the very end. The meteorological observations in his final days read like descriptions from an alien world. Blood-red sunsets lasted for hours, caused by volcanic particles in the upper atmosphere. The ocean itself seemed to glow at night with phosphorescent activity, likely stirred up by underwater seismic disturbances. The air pressure fluctuated so dramatically that it caused physical discomfort, with Beyrinck noting severe ear pain and difficulty maintaining balance. His final recorded measurement of the hot springs showed water temperatures exceeding the boiling point, creating steam clouds so thick they obscured visibility across portions of the island. The ground temperature in some areas reached levels that made walking impossible without protective footwear. Yet Beyrinck continued his rounds, checking equipment and maintaining his beacon with extraordinary determination. The equipment failures that plagued Beyrink's final weeks tell their own story of a man fighting against impossible odds. The lighthouse's clockwork mechanism, which normally required winding twice daily, began running irregularly as seismic vibrations interfered with its delicate gearing. He reported spending hours each day recalibrating the timing, ensuring the light's rotation remained consistent for navigation purposes. The brass fittings that held the lens assembly were expanding and contracting with the extreme temperature fluctuations, requiring constant adjustment and tightening. His food supplies, carefully calculated to last until September, began spoiling at an accelerated rate due to the oppressive heat and sulfurous atmosphere. Preserved meats turning rancid within days of opening, he noted with characteristic precision. Fresh water developing metallic taste, likely due to mineral contamination from underground sources. Reduced to quarter rations to extend supplies, though appetite diminished by atmospheric conditions. The volcanic gases were not just making the air difficult to breathe, they were contaminating everything on the island. Communication with the outside world became his obsession in those final days. Beyond his official logs, Beyrinck began writing detailed letters to family members in Holland, though he had no means of sending them. These personal writings, discovered years later in a waterproof container that somehow survived the eruption, revealed the inner thoughts of a man facing certain death. "My dear sister," one reads, "I write knowing these words may never reach you, yet the act of writing provides comfort in circumstances beyond description. The island speaks now in voices I do not recognize, and I fear I shall not see another Dutch winter." The psychological coping mechanisms he developed show remarkable human resilience. He created elaborate daily routines that extended far beyond lighthouse maintenance, inventing tasks and schedules that provided structure in an increasingly chaotic environment. He began talking to the lighthouse itself, addressing it as old friend in his logs, anthropomorphizing the structure that had become his only constant companion. "Spent evening polishing brass fixtures," reads one entry. "Old friends seem steadier when properly maintained, as do we all. His observations of the night sky during those final weeks provide some of the most poetic passages in his otherwise technical logs. The volcanic particles in the atmosphere created spectacular auroral displays far south of their normal range, painting the equatorial sky in colors that shouldn't have existed at that latitude. "Northern lights dance above southern seas," he wrote on August 23rd. Perhaps the earth itself dreams strange dreams before waking to violence. The beauty is terrible, like watching angels prepare for war. The wildlife exodus continued throughout August, with Byring documenting the departure of each species with the attention of a naturalist. First the birds left, then the small mammals. Finally, even the insects seemed to abandon the island. "Am now sole witness to whatever approaches," he observed. "Even the flies have wisdom enough to flee, yet I remain bound by duty stronger than instinct." This biological warning system, ignored by human authorities but heeded by every other living creature, serves as a tragic commentary on the conflict between civilized obligation and natural survival instincts. His final technical assessments of the lighthouse equipment read like a maintenance manual written for posterity. Every worn component, every jury-rigged repair, every modification he'd made to keep the beacon operational was meticulously documented. It was as if he understood that his professional legacy would outlive his physical presence, that future lighthouse keepers might learn from his innovations under extreme conditions. In the end, Byring's story reminds us that some of history's greatest disasters are illuminated not by the famous or powerful, but by ordinary people doing their jobs under extraordinary circumstances. His lighthouse is gone, destroyed so completely that not even rubble remains. But his courage and dedication shined across the centuries like the beacon he tended until the very end. The loudest sound in recorded history. Let us now explore one of the most fascinating mysteries surrounding the Krakatoa eruption. A phenomenon so extraordinary that it challenges our understanding of sound itself and reveals the awesome power of geological forces in ways that continue to baffle scientists today. We're embarking on a deep exploration into the loudest sound ever recorded in human history. A sound so powerful it traveled around the entire Earth 4 times. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on August 27, 1883, we must first grasp the concept of sound as a physical force. Sound, as we experience it in daily life, consists of pressure waves moving through air. When you speak, your vocal cords create vibrations that push air molecules, creating waves that travel at roughly 343 meters per second. These waves reach your listeners' ears as gentle pressure changes that the brain interprets as words, music, or noise. But what happens when those pressure waves become so intense that they transcend our normal understanding of sound? What occurs when the force creating them is not a human voice or even the most powerful human-made explosion, but the sudden release of energy equivalent to 13,000 times the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima? The morning of August 27, 1883, began with a series of increasingly violent eruptions that had been building for months. At 10:02 a.m. local time, Krakatoa unleashed a blast that fundamentally altered our understanding of what sound could be. The explosion was heard clearly and distinctly on the island of Rodrigues, nearly 3,000 miles away in the Indian Ocean. To put this in perspective, imagine standing in New York City and clearly hearing a sound originating in Denver, Colorado. The chief of police on Rodrigues, a man named James Vollis, was conducting routine morning duties when he heard what he described as the roar of heavy guns. Concerned that a naval battle was taking place somewhere over the horizon, he dispatched patrols to investigate and sent urgent telegrams to British authorities reporting what appeared to be a major military engagement. He had no way of knowing that the gunfire he heard had originated from a volcanic explosion thousands of miles away, farther than the distance from London to the middle of the Sahara Desert. But Rodriguez was not the most distant location to record the sound. Reports flooded in from across the Indian Ocean and beyond. In Australia, cattle stampeded in terror from the mysterious booming sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Aboriginal communities, with their deep connection to natural phenomena, recognized immediately that something unprecedented was occurring, though they had no frame of reference for what they were experiencing. The sound was recorded officially by weather stations and military posts across an area covering 1/13 of the Earth's surface, from Ceylon to the Andaman Islands, from Western Australia to the shores of the Arabian Peninsula. The explosion was not merely detected by sensitive instruments, but heard clearly by human ears as a series of thunderous reports. To understand how this was possible, we must explore the physics of what scientists now call infrasound. Sound waves below the threshold of human hearing that can travel enormous distances. But Krakatoa's explosion was so violent that it created both infrasound and audible sound waves of unprecedented intensity. The pressure wave was so powerful that it pushed through atmospheric layers that normally absorb or deflect sound, creating what acoustic scientists describe as a pressure tsunami moving through the air itself. The barometric pressure readings from weather stations around the world tell a remarkable story. The pressure wave from Krakatoa's explosion was recorded passing through London, Paris, Berlin, New York, and dozens of other cities as a sharp spike in atmospheric pressure readings. These weren't subtle scientific measurements requiring sensitive equipment. They were dramatic changes that caused barometers to swing wildly, weather instruments to malfunction, and sensitive individuals to experience physical discomfort from the sudden pressure changes. The most extraordinary aspect of this acoustic phenomenon was its persistence. The pressure wave didn't simply travel once around the Earth and dissipate. Tracking stations recorded it making 4 complete circumnavigations of the planet over the course of several days. Each passage slightly weaker than the last, but still detectable by instruments. The sound wave was literally bouncing around inside the Earth's atmosphere like a rubber ball in a closed room, gradually losing energy with each circuit, but maintaining enough force to register on barometric equipment for nearly a week. The cultural impact of this unprecedented acoustic event cannot be overstated. In Java and Sumatra, closest to the explosion, the sound was so intense that it ruptured eardrums of people 40 miles away. Sailors on ships hundreds of miles from Krakatoa reported that the sound was physically painful, causing nausea, disorientation, and temporary hearing loss. Some described it not as a sound, but as a physical force that seemed to grab them and shake them like a giant invisible hand. The indigenous peoples of the region, with oral traditions stretching back centuries, had no stories or legends that prepared them for what they experienced. Their traditional knowledge included earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions, but nothing in their cultural memory matched the phenomenon of a sound. So powerful it seemed to come from the very fabric of reality tearing apart. Many communities interpreted it as a supernatural event, the voice of angry spirits, or the sound of the world ending. European colonial observers, trained in scientific observation but lacking the theoretical framework to understand what they were witnessing, struggled to find adequate descriptions. Captain Watson of the steamship Charles Bell, approximately 40 miles from Krakatoa when it exploded, reported that the sound was like the crack of doom. He noted that several crew members were knocked unconscious by the acoustic shock, and that the ship's cat was found dead with no apparent physical injuries, likely killed by the sound itself. The challenge of measuring and understanding this acoustic phenomenon revealed the limitations of 19th century science. While weather stations around the world recorded the pressure changes, there was no systematic network for studying acoustic events of such magnitude. Scientists of the era were forced to piece together the story from scattered observations, creating one of the first truly global scientific investigations in history. Modern acoustic science has used computer modeling to estimate that the sound from Krakatoa reached levels of approximately 180 decibels at a distance of 100 miles from the explosion. To understand this measurement, consider that normal conversation occurs at about 60 decibels. A rock concert might reach 115 decibels, and the threshold of pain for human hearing is around 125 decibels. The Krakatoa explosion created sound levels that were literally off any scale previously imagined. The sound waves created by the explosion also provide insights into the internal structure of our planet's atmosphere. By analyzing how the sound traveled, reflected, and attenuated over such vast distances, scientists gained new understanding of atmospheric layers, temperature gradients, and the complex dynamics of how energy moves through air masses. The explosion essentially turned the entire Earth into a vast acoustic laboratory, providing data about atmospheric physics that wouldn't be duplicated until the nuclear age. Archaeological evidence of the sound's impact can still be found today. In coastal areas thousands of miles from Krakatoa, researchers have discovered geological signatures where the pressure wave caused landslides, avalanches, and other ground disturbances. Buildings in India and Australia show structural damage consistent with acoustic shock, cracks and failures that occurred at precisely the time when the pressure wave passed through those regions. The mystery deepens when we consider what this tells us about the explosion itself. To create sound waves of such intensity and range, the actual energy release must have been almost beyond comprehension. Modern volcanologists estimate that the explosion instantaneously vaporized millions of tons of rock, seawater, and organic matter, creating a fireball that briefly contained more concentrated energy than the sun itself. The sound we're discussing was merely the atmospheric byproduct of this unimaginable release of geological force. Perhaps most intriguingly, the acoustic signature of Krakatoa has never been duplicated. Despite humanity's creation of increasingly powerful explosions throughout the 20th century, nuclear weapons, while devastating in their immediate vicinity, have never produced sound waves that traveled with the intensity and distance of Krakatoa's eruption. This suggests that there was something unique about the geological conditions that created not just a powerful explosion, but one that coupled with the atmosphere in a way that maximized acoustic transmission. The cultural reverberations of the loudest sound in history extended far beyond the immediate acoustic event. News of the explosion, and particularly reports of the sound being heard across such vast distances, created a new awareness of global interconnectedness. For the first time in human history, people around the world realized that a natural event in one location could have immediate, measurable effects on the opposite side of the planet. The technological limitations of 1883 meant that humanity's first encounter with a truly global acoustic phenomenon was documented through a patchwork of individual observations rather than systematic scientific measurement. Telegraph operators across the British Empire found themselves at the center of an unprecedented information-gathering effort as reports flooded in from remote outposts, trading stations, and colonial administrative centers. The telegraph cables themselves became inadvertent scientific instruments, as the pressure changes caused by the sound wave created electrical disturbances that could be measured and timed. The medical effects of exposure to such intense sound waves provide another layer to this acoustic mystery, in addition to the ruptured eardrums reported near the epicenter. Doctors across the region documented a range of symptoms that they struggled to understand or treat. Patients presented with severe headaches, nausea, temporary blindness, and what would now be recognized as symptoms of acoustic trauma. Some individuals reported persistent ringing in their ears that lasted for weeks, while others experienced a temporary condition that modern medicine would identify as noise-induced hearing loss. The animal kingdom's response to the Krakatoa sound reveals aspects of the event that human senses could not detect. Elephants in India and Ceylon were observed exhibiting extreme agitation at precisely the times when the pressure wave passed through those regions, suggesting they could sense infrasonic components of the blast that were below human hearing thresholds. Dogs across Southeast Asia began howling in coordinated episodes that occurred simultaneously across thousands of miles, as if responding to some invisible signal that transcended normal communication patterns. Marine life provided some of the most dramatic evidence of the sound's reach and power. Whales were observed exhibiting unusual behavior patterns across the entire Indian Ocean basin in the days following the eruption. These creatures, which rely on long-distance acoustic communication, seemed disoriented and confused, suggesting that the massive sound event had disrupted their normal social structures and navigation systems. Dead fish washed ashore on beaches thousands of miles from Krakatoa, their internal organs apparently damaged by the intense pressure waves transmitted through the water. The atmospheric science implications of the Krakatoa sound have only become fully apparent with modern understanding of how pressure waves interact with different layers of the atmosphere. The explosion occurred during specific atmospheric conditions that created what scientists now recognize as an ideal acoustic waveguide. Channels in the atmosphere that can carry sound much farther than would normally be possible. Temperature, inversions, wind patterns, and humidity levels all aligned to create conditions that maximized the sound's transmission distance. Religious and spiritual communities around the world interpreted the global acoustic event through their own theological frameworks, creating a fascinating cross-cultural study of how different societies processed unprecedented natural phenomena. Islamic scholars in the Middle East wrote extensively about whether the sound represented divine communication, while Buddhist monks in Tibet incorporated the event into their understanding of cosmic interconnectedness. Christian missionaries in Africa reported that local converts interpreted the sound as the voice of God speaking directly to humanity. The economic impact of the sound itself, separate from the eruption's other effects, created ripple effects across global markets. Insurance companies in London found themselves dealing with claims for broken windows and structural damage in locations thousands of miles from any known explosion. Lloyd's of London had to develop new categories for acoustic damage, creating precedents that would influence insurance policies well into the modern era. The sound's persistence, traveling around the Earth 4 times, created a unique opportunity for comparative acoustic analysis across different geographical and meteorological conditions. Weather stations in equatorial regions recorded different acoustic signatures than those in temperate zones, suggesting that latitude, altitude, and local weather patterns all influenced how the sound propagated. This natural experiment provided insights into atmospheric dynamics that wouldn't be duplicated until the advent of nuclear testing decades later. Indigenous knowledge systems that had evolved over millennia to interpret natural phenomena found themselves confronted with something entirely outside their experiential framework. Traditional weather predictors and natural historians among native populations had extensive knowledge of volcanic activity, but none had stories or analytical frameworks that could accommodate a sound that traveled across continents. This challenged fundamental assumptions about the local nature of natural events and contributed to a broader transformation in how cultures understood their place in global natural systems. The acoustic signature of Krakatoa also revealed previously unknown aspects of how sound interacts with the Earth's magnetic field and ionosphere. Sensitive magnetic instruments recorded disturbances that coincided with the passage of the pressure wave, suggesting electromagnetic effects that scientists of the 1880s were completely unprepared to understand or measure. These observations would later contribute to the development of modern atmospheric physics and our understanding of how acoustic energy can influence electromagnetic phenomena. The preservation of acoustic evidence in geological formations provides one of the most intriguing aspects of the Krakatoa sound mystery. Cave systems across Southeast Asia and beyond show evidence of acoustic resonance effects that occurred precisely when the pressure wave passed through those regions. Stalactites and stalagmites in certain formations show fracture patterns consistent with intense acoustic vibration, creating a permanent geological record of the sound's passage. These formations essentially became natural recording devices, preserving evidence of the acoustic event in stone. The human psychological response to experiencing a sound of such unprecedented magnitude created lasting trauma in survivors that extended far beyond physical hearing damage. Psychiatric records from the period, though limited by 19th century understanding of mental health, document cases of what would now be recognized as acoustic shock syndrome. Individuals who experienced the full intensity of the sound near the epicenter reported persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and an inability to tolerate even normal levels of noise for months or years afterward. The interaction between the acoustic wave and existing architectural structures created a vast unintended experiment in acoustic engineering. Buildings constructed using traditional Dutch colonial methods showed different damage patterns than those built using local Indonesian techniques, revealing fundamental differences in how various architectural styles respond to acoustic stress. Some structures actually amplified the sound wave, creating acoustic focal points that caused more damage than areas that experienced the direct pressure wave. Seismographic stations around the world, still relatively new technology in 1883, recorded not just the acoustic wave, but also secondary seismic effects caused by the sound itself. The intense pressure wave was powerful enough to trigger small earthquakes and landslides in geologically unstable areas thousands of miles from Krakatoa. This phenomenon, where acoustic energy converts to seismic energy through interaction with the Earth's surface, provided early insights into the interconnected nature of atmospheric and geological systems. The botanical response to the acoustic event offers another dimension to understanding its global impact. Trees in areas where the pressure wave passed showed growth ring abnormalities for the following growing seasons, suggesting that the intense acoustic stress had affected their cellular structure. Garden plants and agricultural crops in regions that experienced the sound exhibited unusual flowering patterns and growth rates, possibly due to the acoustic stimulation of their cellular processes. The development of early audio recording technology in the decades following Krakatoa was partly influenced by scientists' desire to understand and potentially capture similar acoustic events. Thomas Edison and other inventors were specifically motivated by reports of the Krakatoa sound to develop more sensitive acoustic detection equipment. The eruption essentially created the first global demand for acoustic measurement technology, spurring innovations that would later enable the recording and analysis of sound phenomena. Cultural anthropologists studying the long-term effects of the Krakatoa sound have identified lasting changes in local folklore and oral traditions across the affected regions. Stories and songs that emerged in the years following 1883 consistently incorporate themes of world-spanning sound, voices from the earth, and the interconnectedness of distant places. These cultural artifacts represent humanity's attempt to process and integrate an experience that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of sound and distance. The meteorological data collected during the acoustic events passage provided unprecedented insights into upper atmospheric conditions that wouldn't be matched until the development of weather balloons and satellite technology. The sound wave essentially functioned as a massive atmospheric probe, revealing temperature gradients, wind patterns, and pressure variations at altitudes that were otherwise inaccessible to 19th century science. This acoustic mystery remains one of the most compelling aspects of the Krakatoa eruption, a reminder that our planet is capable of unleashing forces that transcend our everyday understanding of physical laws. The sound that shook the world on August 27, 1883, continues to echo through scientific literature, a testament to the awesome power that lies sleeping beneath our feet, waiting for the right conditions to wake the entire earth with its voice. How the wealthy and powerful experienced history's loudest disaster. As we conclude our journey through the Krakatoa catastrophe, let us examine how this unprecedented natural disaster was experienced by those with wealth, power, and privilege, those who lived in comfortable drawing rooms thousands of miles away, yet still felt the tremor of history's loudest sound. Their experience provides a fascinating contrast to the intimate terror faced by lighthouse keepers and island dwellers, revealing how even the most catastrophic natural events can be filtered through the lens of social status and geographical distance. In the grand colonial mansions of Batavia, the administrative heart of the Dutch East Indies, the morning of August 27, 1883, began with the comfortable routines of imperial privilege. The Governor-General's residence, a sprawling complex of marble halls and manicured gardens, housed the most powerful Dutch officials in Southeast Asia. These men controlled trade routes worth millions of guilders, commanded armies, and made decisions that affected the lives of millions of indigenous people across the archipelago. The Governor-General himself, Frederick Sigismund, was taking his morning coffee on the veranda when the first reports of unusual seismic activity reached his staff. From his perspective, nearly 100 miles from Krakatoa, the initial tremors were merely a minor inconvenience, causing his fine china to rattle gently and creating small ripples in his coffee cup. He had no way of knowing that he was experiencing the early stages of one of the most powerful natural disasters in recorded history. The social hierarchy of colonial society created distinct layers of experience during the crisis. The European elite, insulated by distance, wealth, and architectural sophistication, initially perceived the events as an interesting scientific curiosity rather than an immediate threat. Their homes, built with the finest materials and engineering techniques available, were designed to withstand tropical storms and minor earthquakes. The thick walls, high ceilings, and robust construction that represented luxury also provided significant protection against the acoustic shock that was building across the region. As reports filtered in throughout the morning from outlying districts and trading posts, the colonial administration's response reflected both the capabilities and limitations of 19th century imperial governance. Telegraph operators worked frantically to maintain communication with distant settlements, but the messages they received painted an increasingly confusing and alarming picture. From their comfortable offices, filled with polished mahogany furniture and detailed maps of their territories, Dutch administrators struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. The The wealthy merchant families who formed the backbone of colonial society experienced the disaster through the lens of economic concern rather than personal survival. The Van der Berg Trading House, one of the most prominent Dutch commercial enterprises in the Indies, maintained offices in a luxurious compound complete with private docks, warehouses filled with valuable spices and textiles, and residential quarters that rivaled European palaces in their opulence. When the Great Sound reached Batavia at 10:02 a.m., it struck these elite compounds with reduced but still significant force. The experience for the wealthy was one of profound confusion and growing alarm rather than immediate terror. Windows shattered in expensive homes, fine crystal collections were destroyed, and carefully maintained gardens were damaged by the pressure wave, but lives were not immediately threatened. The sound, while startling and unprecedented, was filtered through walls of privilege that provided both physical and psychological protection. The social response of the colonial elite reveals much about the mindset of imperial governance during crisis situations. Initial meetings, called by the Governor-General, focused not on immediate humanitarian relief, but on protecting trade routes and maintaining administrative control. The wealthy class's first concern was the potential disruption to their commercial enterprises rather than the welfare of local populations who were bearing the brunt of the disaster. As the day progressed and more alarming reports arrived, the elite's comfortable detachment began to erode. The Colonial Club, normally a haven of refined conversation and leisurely card games, became an impromptu crisis center where wealthy planters, government officials, and military officers gathered to share information and coordinate responses. The atmosphere shifted from casual concern to growing anxiety as the true scope of the catastrophe became apparent. The contrast between elite experience and local suffering became starkly apparent as rescue operations began. While wealthy European families worried about property damage and business losses, entire indigenous communities had been obliterated by tsunamis and volcanic debris. The colonial administration's response reflected these priorities, with resources initially directed toward protecting European interests and infrastructure rather than providing emergency aid to affected local populations. The technological advantages available to the wealthy during the crisis highlight the inequality of disaster response in colonial society. The Governor-General's residence had access to the most advanced communication equipment available, including telegraph connections to Europe and other major cities. Wealthy merchants could dispatch private ships to investigate conditions and evacuate their assets, while ordinary people in affected areas had no means of escape or communication with the outside world. The scientific curiosity of the educated elite provides another layer to understanding their experience of the disaster. The colonial administration included several trained naturalists and engineers who approached the eruption as a fascinating natural phenomenon worthy of careful study. Dr. Rogier Verbeek, the colonial government's chief geologist, was already planning systematic investigations of the eruption's effects, even as the catastrophe was still unfolding. From the safety of his well-appointed study, Dr. Verbeek began collecting reports and organizing what would become one of the most comprehensive scientific investigations of a natural disaster up to that time. His ability to approach the event as a subject for academic study rather than a survival crisis exemplifies the privilege that distance and resources provided to the colonial elite. The social dynamics within elite circles during the crisis reveal the complex interactions between personal relationships, professional obligations, and class loyalties that characterized colonial society. Dinner parties, scheduled for the evening of August 27th, were cancelled not due to immediate danger, but out of respect for the growing realization that something unprecedented had occurred. the wealthy could afford the luxury of appropriate social responses to distant tragedy. The economic implications of the disaster occupied much of the elite's attention during the immediate aftermath. The Sunda Strait was one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, carrying trade between Europe, India, and the Far East worth millions of pounds annually. The potential disruption to these commercial networks was of immediate concern to wealthy merchants and colonial administrators, whose fortunes depended on maintaining smooth trade operations. Insurance companies with offices in Batavia found themselves confronting claims unlike anything in their previous experience. The concept of volcanic insurance was virtually unknown, and the global scope of the acoustic damage created legal and financial challenges that would take years to resolve. Wealthy policyholders began filing claims for everything from shattered windows to damaged cargo, creating a bureaucratic nightmare for companies accustomed to dealing with more conventional forms of property loss. The military response, coordinated by colonial authorities, reflected both the capabilities and priorities of imperial governance. The Dutch East Indies Army, commanded by European officers but staffed largely by local troops, was mobilized not primarily for humanitarian relief but to maintain civil order and protect European interests. The contrast with local community responses, which focused immediately on mutual aid and survival, highlights the different values and priorities of colonial administration. Communication with Europe became a priority for the colonial elite as news of the disaster spread. Families with relatives in the Netherlands faced the challenge of explaining unprecedented events through the limited vocabulary of telegraph messages. The cost of international communication meant that only the wealthy could afford to send detailed reports to Europe, creating an information bottleneck that shaped how the disaster was initially understood in European capitals. The psychological impact of the eruption on the colonial elite was complex and multifaceted. While they were spared the immediate terror experienced by those closer to the volcano, they faced the unsettling realization that their comfortable world of predictable routines and controllable risks had been fundamentally challenged. The sound that had traveled around the world served as a reminder that even the most privileged positions could not provide complete insulation from the forces of nature. Religious responses within elite circles reflected the complex, theological challenges posed by such an unprecedented natural event. The Dutch Reformed Church, which served the spiritual needs of the colonial administration, struggled to provide appropriate religious context for a disaster of such magnitude. Wealthy parishioners who had never questioned their privileged position in God's creation found themselves confronting theological questions about divine justice and natural catastrophe. The long-term economic and social consequences of the eruption would reshape colonial society in ways that the elite were only beginning to understand on that August morning. Trade routes would be permanently altered, insurance practices would be revolutionized, and the psychological impact of witnessing nature's power would influence colonial policy for decades to come. The domestic arrangements of elite households during the crisis revealed the complex social dynamics that governed colonial life even during unprecedented emergencies. The Governor-General's mansion employed dozens of Indonesian servants, gardeners, and administrative staff whose own families lived in areas much more vulnerable to the eruption's effects. Yet the household's response prioritized protecting European residents and maintaining the routines of colonial privilege, even as their employees worried about relatives in the disaster zone. The servants' quarters, located in separate buildings behind the main residence, experienced the acoustic shock more severely due to their lighter construction and less sophisticated engineering. While the Governor-General's family gathered in their reinforced drawing room to discuss the strange events, their Indonesian staff dealt with damaged living spaces and concerns for family members in coastal villages that might have been affected by tsunamis. This stark contrast in experience occurred within the same compound, separated by only a few hundred yards, but worlds apart in terms of security and resources. The elaborate social protocols that governed colonial society continued to operate even during the crisis, revealing how deeply ingrained hierarchies influenced responses to emergency situations. When wealthy plantation owners arrived at the colonial club seeking information and coordination, they were served refreshments by staff whose own communities were potentially devastated. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining social niceties while discussing catastrophic destruction highlights the psychological mechanisms that allowed the colonial elite to function during crisis. The children of elite families experienced the disaster through yet another lens, one filtered by protective parents and privileged circumstances that shielded them from the full reality of the events. Young European children in Batavia were told that the strange sounds and trembling buildings were merely unusual weather, while their parents worked frantically behind closed doors to assess the true scope of the catastrophe. These children, who would grow up to become the next generation of colonial administrators, carried with them memories of adults behaving mysteriously during a time when the world seemed to shake and roar for reasons no one would properly explain. The women of colonial elite society found themselves in particularly complex positions during the crisis. European women in the Dutch East Indies occupied a unique social niche, expected to maintain the cultural standards of the homeland while adapting to tropical colonial life. When the Krakatoa eruption disrupted their carefully ordered world, they became informal coordinators of relief efforts within their social circles, while remaining largely excluded from official decision-making processes. Mrs. Cornelia van Houten, wife of a prominent spice trader, organized what may have been the first systematic charity effort by colonial elites for local disaster victims. From her elegant parlor, decorated with the finest Indonesian textiles and European furniture, she coordinated donations of food, medical supplies, and clothing for affected communities. Her efforts reveal both the genuine humanitarian impulses of some colonials and the paternalistic assumptions that governed their approach to helping indigenous populations. The artistic and cultural responses of the elite to the eruption provide another window into their experience of the disaster. Several prominent colonial families included amateur artists and writers who attempted to capture their impressions of the unprecedented events. Their paintings, sketches, and diary entries from the period show an fascination with the aesthetic aspects of the catastrophe, the unusual colors of the sky, the dramatic cloud formations, and the sublime terror of witnessing nature's power from a safe distance. The educational implications of the disaster for elite children were carefully managed by their European tutors and governesses. The eruption became a teachable moment about geography, natural science, and the power of divine providence, but always presented through the lens of European superiority and colonial mission. Children were taught to see the disaster as an example of the dangerous, unpredictable nature of the tropics that justified European control and civilization. The technological responses available to the wealthy during the crisis highlight the growing importance of modern communication and transportation systems in maintaining colonial control. The Governor-General's residence was equipped with the latest telegraph equipment, allowing real-time communication with other administrative centers and, eventually, with Europe. This technological advantage allowed elite decision-makers to coordinate responses across vast distances, while local populations remained cut off from outside assistance. Private yacht owners among the colonial elite found themselves in possession of some of the most valuable resources in the region. Vessels capable of evacuating people from affected areas or delivering emergency supplies to isolated communities. However, the decision of how to use these resources revealed the priorities and prejudices of colonial society. Most wealthy boat owners focused on protecting their own interests and those of other Europeans rather than mounting broader rescue operations. The long-term changes in colonial society that resulted from the Krakatoa eruption were already beginning to manifest within hours of the explosion, though the elite were only beginning to understand their implications. The demonstration of nature's power to disrupt even the most carefully planned colonial enterprises would influence everything from building codes to insurance policies to military preparedness in the decades that followed. As we reach the end of our exploration of the Krakatoa eruption, we see how even the most catastrophic natural disasters affect different social classes in vastly different ways. The wealthy elite of Batavia experienced history's loudest sound as a distant rumble that rattled their windows and disrupted their routines, while lighthouse keepers like Byrink faced it as the literal end of their world. These contrasting experiences remind us that natural disasters, while seemingly universal in their impact, are always filtered through the lens of human society with all its inequalities and disparities. The elite's response to Krakatoa, characterized by scientific curiosity, economic concern, and administrative efficiency, stands in stark contrast to the immediate survival struggles of those who lived closer to the volcano. Yet both experiences are part of the same historical event. Different facets of humanity's encounter with the awesome power of geological forces that recognize no social boundaries and respect no human hierarchies. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed. Unlike the people we just learned about, sleep well.